Hey there, quick question. If you owe your friend 50 bucks, why can't you just grab a marker, cross it out, and say, boom, debt canceled? We're good now. I mean, it's literally just numbers on paper, right? Now take that question and scale it up to governments. Why can't a country just wake up one morning, stretch, sip some coffee, and say, you know what, let's just cancel all this debt stuff? New spreadsheet, fresh vibes. Because here's the weird part. Governments absolutely can print money. They can pass laws. They can change rules. So why does debt, sometimes trillions of dollars, just sit there like an unskippable cutscene in a video game? To answer that, let me introduce you to Bob. Bob is doing fine. Not billionaire fine. Bud pays his rent on time and owns a decent couch fine. Bob buys a house. He doesn't have $300,000 in cash stuffed under his mattress because nobody does. So Bob takes out a mortgage. The bank gives Bob the money. Bob promises to pay it back slowly, with interest. Normal. Boring. Adult stuff. Now imagine Bob goes back to the bank one day and says, hey, great news. I've decided this debt thing is kind of inconvenient, so I'm canceling. The banker doesn't laugh. The banker doesn't smile. The banker slowly blinks. Because from the bank's perspective, that money wasn't imaginary. It was someone else's savings, pension funds, retirement accounts, other people's deposits. Bob's mortgage is somebody else's investment. And that's the first big clue. Government debt isn't just a bill. It's someone else's asset. When a government borrows money, it doesn't borrow from a single evil villain in a chair petting a cat. It borrows from regular people through pension funds, banks, insurance companies, other governments, sometimes even its own citizens directly. In other words, when a government owes money, millions of people are on the other side expecting to get paid. So what happens if the government says, actually, never mind? Well, those pensions, suddenly lighter. Those banks, suddenly shakier. Those retirement funds, suddenly awkward at family dinners. Canceling debt doesn't make it disappear. It moves the pain. Now you might say, okay, fine. But what if the government just cancels the debt it owes to itself? Ah, yes. The checkmate, economists move. Here's the problem. Governments don't really owe money to a magic internal wallet. They issue bonds. Those bonds are promises. And promises are fragile things. Imagine Bob again. Bob doesn't cancel his mortgage. Instead, he tells everyone, hey, I might stop paying debts whenever I feel like it. What happens next? Nobody lends Bob money again. Ever. Not for a house. Not for a business. Not even for a used lawnmower. Because lending isn't about the past. It's about trust in the future. Government debt works the same way. A government bond isn't just, here's some money. It's a handshake that says, we are boring. Predictable. We pay our bills. The moment a government cancels debt on purpose, it tells the world our promises are optional. And investors have excellent memories. Now here's where it gets spicy. Some people say, okay, but what if we just print money to pay the debt? And yes, governments can do that. They do it sometimes. But printing money to erase debt is like using a flamethrower to kill a mosquito. It worked, but now your house is on fire. When you create a lot of new money without creating new stuff, new goods, new services, new productivity, prices rise. That's inflation. Your salary buys less. Your savings shrink quietly. Your grocery bill starts acting suspicious. So instead of saying, we canceled debt, what you really said was, we charged everyone an invisible tax. And here's the sneaky part. Inflation doesn't send a bill. It just slowly eats purchasing power while smiling politely. Now let's go one layer deeper. Why do governments borrow in the first place? If debt is so annoying, why not just avoid it? Because debt lets governments do things now. Build roads before they crumble. Fight wars they didn't schedule. Rescue economies that just face planted. Debt is time travel. It pulls future money into the present. Canceling debt is the opposite. It pushes today's problems into tomorrow's trust crisis. And trust is the real currency here. Not dollars, not euros, not yen. Trust. Once that cracks, everything gets more expensive. Interest rates go up, borrowing gets harder, budgets get tighter. So even if a government could cancel debt, the price it pays afterward might be worse than the debt itself. Now here's the twist most people miss. Governments do reduce debt all the time, just not with a dramatic debt canceled button. They grow their economies. They let inflation nibble slowly. They refinance. They roll old debt into new debt. It's less like deleting a file and more like constantly reorganizing a messy closet. And that brings us to the uncomfortable truth. Debt isn't a glitch in the system. It is the system. Modern economies run on promises stacked on top of promises. The moment you casually break them, everything starts asking uncomfortable questions. Like, who's next? And if they did it once, why wouldn't they do it again? Which is why governments treat debt cancellation the way Bob treats texting his ex. Possible, but only if you're ready for the consequences. Because once you send that message, you don't get to control what comes back. And that's where things start getting really interesting. Because once you send that message, you don't get to control what comes back. Now let's talk about what does come back. Usually it's something like this: higher interest rates. Imagine Bob again. Bob didn't cancel his debt. He just hinted that he might stop paying sometimes. The next bank he visits smiles politely and says, "Sure, Bob, we'll lend to you." But instead of 4% interest, how does 12% sound? That's not punishment. That's insurance. Lenders don't stop lending to risky borrowers right away. They just charge more to cover the risk. Governments face the exact same thing. If investors think a government might cancel debt someday, they demand higher interest today. Which means more tax money goes to interest, less money goes to schools, healthcare, infrastructure, budgets get squeezed, politicians get cranky. So canceling debt doesn't free up money. It often makes future borrowing more expensive. And here's the extra painful part. Governments don't get to say, okay, but this one time doesn't count. Markets don't work on pinky promises. They work on patterns. Once trust is damaged, it takes years, sometimes decades, to rebuild. Now let's address the big emotional question. But isn't it unfair that future generations have to pay today's debt? Yes. And also, no. Because future generations also inherit the stuff the debt paid for. Roads, universities, power grids, hospitals, entire cities. Debt is like a credit card used to build a house. Your kids didn't swipe the card, but they live in the house. Canceling the debt doesn't magically make the house free. It just shifts who absorbs the cost. And here's where things get uncomfortable. If you cancel government debt, who actually loses? Not the government. Real people. Pensioners whose retirement funds held government bonds. Workers whose savings were invested safely in boring government debt. Banks that suddenly have holes in their balance sheets, which leads to layoffs, and bank bailouts, and taxpayer money, which means you're back where you started. Now, there are cases where governments effectively cancel debt. They just don't call it that. Sometimes they negotiate restructurings. Sometimes they stretch payments over longer periods. Sometimes inflation slowly erodes the real value of the debt. It's like quietly lowering the volume instead of smashing the speaker. Messy? Yes. Dramatic? No. But stability usually isn't dramatic. And this is why just cancel the debt sounds simple, but behaves like a wrecking ball in practice. Debt is boring. Debt is paperwork. Debt is promises stacked on spreadsheets. And boring systems hate sudden emotional decisions. Now let's zoom out for a second. Why does this question keep coming up? Because debt feels fate. You can't touch it. You can't see it. It's just numbers moving around. But money itself is also just numbers. The real thing is trust. Trust that $1 tomorrow will still mean something. Trust that a bond will be honored. Trust that rules won't suddenly change overnight. Once people lose that trust, they don't panic loudly. They quietly adjust. They move money. They raise prices. They stop investing. And those quiet adjustments hurt more than any official announcement. So when someone says, why can't governments just cancel debt? What they're really asking is, why can't we keep the benefits of the system without accepting the constraints of the system? And the honest answer is, because systems don't work that way. You don't get the safety without the seatbelt. You don't get borrowing without repayment. You don't get trust without consequences. Debt cancellation isn't impossible. It's just extremely expensive in invisible ways. And governments, boring, slow, cautious creatures that they are, usually decide it's cheaper to live with debt than to break the rules that keep the whole thing standing. So in conclusion, governments can't just cancel debt the same way you can't just delete a promise without consequences. That debt is someone else's savings, someone else's retirement, someone else's sense that the system still works. Canceling it doesn't make the cost disappear. It just moves it, disguises it, or delays it. And in a world built on trust, breaking promises is one of the most expensive moves you can make. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.